All right, sports fans, how's everybody out there doing? William Martin coming at you one more time here on YouTube with another edition of the 300 Pounds of Sports Knowledge Podcast. Now, we just saw longtime rivals in the New York Mets and Philadelphia Phillies meet in the postseason for the first time in a battle of two raucous fan bases as well, where there's simply no love lost from. But nonetheless, getting back to the action on the baseball diamond when the dust settled last night, it was the Mets who were moving on as they disposed of the Phillies in 4 games in the National League Divisional Series. The Mets have been in playoff mode now for several weeks, of course, and this dates back to the regular season when they had to get it together coming down the stretch. And of course, it was highlighted by their comeback win in game 1 of that doubleheader against the Atlanta Braves a couple of weeks ago for them just to even get into the postseason. Okay. And, we saw that epic series in the wild card round with the Mets and the Milwaukee Brewers, their comeback win in the ninth, and that one in the decisive game 3. And of course, they just kept that momentum going to this series with the Phillies. And for me, New York set the tone in game 1 when their bats were able to get to that Phillies bullpen. And remember, the way that game started, the Mets could not hit Zach Wheeler. Okay, Zach Wheeler was as dominant could be, and then of course he was taken out after the 7th inning, and then we saw the bats of the Mets get a reprieve. They woke up, and of course they went on to get the 6-2 win. Game 2, we saw the Mets jump out early, and then it was the Phillies' chance to come back, not before the Mets came back themselves, but then the Phillies found a way to, gut it out and get the game 2 win at Citizens Bank. And of course, they had some momentum for themselves now as the series shifted to Queens for game 3. But then we saw the Mets set the tone early in that one. You knew that the crowd at City Field was hungry, and the team fed off of that. Why? Because the folks in Queens had not seen their Mets play at home for several weeks. And of course, it's been an amazing ride for the Amazings. And I think, you already had a crowd that was on the edge of their seats. And then when guys like Pete Alonso come out there early and get, big time home runs to really get the crowd into the game, forget about it. Sean Manaea pitched a gem for the Mets in game number 3. And of course, they went on to the game 3 win. And then, of course, in game 4 yesterday, the Mets had so many opportunities early, leaving guys on base. And finally, they broke through, trailing 1-0 in the 6th when Francisco Lindor hit that grand slam. And then, of course, the rest is history as New York went on to win this series 3 games to 1. So you look at it, and of course, you could take away several things from this, depending on which avenue you want to attack. Do you want to say that it was good Mets pitching, or was it bad Philly hitting? Either way, the Phillies did not hit in this series as a team. They only batted 186 with on base percentage, or with an on base percentage of 295, and they just slugged a little bit over 300. And once you take Bryce Harper and Nick Castellanos out of that equation, those numbers go down drastically because they were the only ones that were hitting for the Phils in this series. And you think about it, the timely hitting was all done by the New York Mets. I mean, you think about it, from the 7th inning on in this series, the Mets just dominated. Okay, that was a big factor in this series. The Mets simply were, you know, they were there. And I know that, there's going to be some Phillies fans that right now are upset that their team lost to the Mets. I totally get it. Teams never fan bases never want to see their teams lose, especially to their rivals. Okay. But then on top of that, as good as of a season that the Phillies did have, their season series with the Mets, they only won it 7 games to 6. So it's kind of like, it was like they were right there. And then on top of that, but of course, because we are seeing it more often with the expanded postseason in Major League Baseball, we're seeing more teams that are in the same division face each other. You got it going on right now with the Padres and the Dodgers. You also have it going with the Guardians and the Tigers as well. But nonetheless, when you have teams that are so familiar with one another, you simply throw the rule book out. Why? Because there's nothing that you're going to show them that they haven't seen, vice versa. And I think for the Mets, clearly they had a ton of confidence in the way that they beat the Braves to get into the postseason. That's number one, especially since the Braves have been a nemesis for the Mets franchise for a month of Sundays and then some. Okay. But then the way that they came back and won that Milwaukee series, especially the fact that Pete Alonso had not been producing, and then the way that he was able to produce and extend his Mets career. And then, of course, that catapulted them into this divisional round. And I think they built off of that. We saw Pete Alonso, who has been swinging a better bat for the Mets right now. Of course, we've seen what Francisco Lindor has been doing, but now it's kind of like every single night, every single game, it's a different guy, and they're not shying away from it. We saw the Phillies start off strong this season. All right. And basically, they got did in by what they've done over the last two postseasons. Of course, we saw the Phillies in 2022 be that team to, squeak into the playoffs. They swept St. Louis in the wild card round. And then, of course, before you blinked, they beat the Atlanta Braves. And then, it was on to, the LCS. And then, of course, the World Series. Last year, we saw the Phillies get in as a wild card again. They beat the Braves and they got to the LCS before they fell to the Arizona Diamondbacks. But nonetheless, the tables turned this year. The Phillies started off strong. They had their moments in the second half of the season, but they slumped. And, it's one of those where they came into the series cold, no disrespect to the Mets, while the Mets were simply clicking on all cylinders. And you saw one thing from this Mets team that you saw from the Phillies the last couple of years in the postseason: no fear. And I think once the Mets were able to get to the Phillies in game one, win a game where Zach Wheeler dominated and they still won, you know what? They were like, okay, we've got this. And then they came back. They basically beat the Phillies' two best pitchers in this series, and Aaron Nola and Zach Wheeler. And that to me, if you're the Mets, that is a huge shot in the arm right there. Is just cast a band of brothers. They simply have been going out there and they continue to go out there and find ways to make it happen. You look at this for the Mets, though, regardless of who it's going to be, whether it's going to be the Padres or whether it's going to be the Dodgers that they're going to face in the LCS, they're going to be a tough out for that team. I know that the Mets are not going to have home field advantage once again. It's going to be a situation where they got to go to California, whether it's Los Angeles or San Diego, but nonetheless, they're going to be ready to go. And getting Kodai Senga back in this Philly series, I think, was big. We saw him pitch 2 innings in game number two, and then from there, he made way for the bullpen. And I think they're going to stretch him out a little bit more. I do believe for the LCS, whether it's against LA or San Diego, but nonetheless, neither one of these teams have really seen Kodai Senga play this year because he's been injured for the most part. There's also a possibility that the Mets get Jeff McNeil back. And of course, the question is going to be, do you want to go with Jeff McNeil at second, the veteran, or the rookie Luis Angel Acuna in this series? And then, of course, what do you do with Jose Iglesias? I mean, Jose Iglesias has been too vital for the Mets over the second half and on this postseason run for you to sit him down at this point. And if you're Carlos Mendoza, who has been pushing all of the right buttons in this run for the Mets, I don't see him sitting down Iglesias because he's brought something to this team with his defense as well as his at bats and his hustle. Again, right now for the Mets, it's a band of brothers, like I said, going into the postseason after the Milwaukee series. And I'm going to say it again after they just knocked off the Phillies. This is a team that's playing with house money. And you've got some veteran guys who are on 1-year deals. You also have some guys that are in their walk years, and you have some young guys on this team that are hungry. And it's all centered around the Mets' best player right now, and Francisco Lindor. I guarantee you there were plenty of Met fans initially who questioned the Mets giving $341 million to Lindor after they acquired him from the Cleveland Guardians. But nonetheless, I guarantee you most of those Met fans are not saying that right now. This guy, especially in the second half of the season for the Mets, has proven to be clutch. He got it going. He picked up his average. He got hot at the plate. And you think about most of the big plays, the big moments for the Mets in the second half and this postseason have revolved around one Francisco Lindor. You saw him with that home run against the Braves to get the Mets in the post into the postseason. It was kind of like, you know what, been there, done that. And the same thing was last night when he got the what would be the eventual game winning or series clinching home run for the Mets as they knocked off the Phillies. And again, getting back to this, I know that there are going to be some Philly fans that are upset that their team lost to the Mets. It's, the fact that their season, their once promising season, is now over, and I totally get it, and I totally understand. But at the same time, people should not like go out there and say, "Oh, the Mets are a bad team." It's not like we're dealing with an 81-81 team that got into the postseason and upset a 105 loss Phillies team. No, the Mets won 89 games this year. They finished 6 games behind the Phillies for first place in the National League East. And winning 89 games in the regular season in Major League Baseball is not easy. Am I going to sit up here and say that the Mets were the 27 Yankees? Absolutely not. But it's not a bad, quote unquote, Cinderella team, if you will. At the end of the day, Carlos Mendoza, the Mets manager, just simply outmanaged Rob Thompson in the series. And I know that the folks in Philly are not thrilled by some of the decision making by Thompson in this series. At the end of the day, uh, the Mets just out executed the Phillies. They were outmanaged, if you will, and the Mets just simply beat the Philadelphia Phillies in every phase of the game. Outside of Game Two, the Phillies never scored more than 2 runs in any of the contests this series, as the Mets pitching just kept them on their toes. The bats went cold. Whatever you want to say, the bottom line is the Phillies did not get it done against the Mets. So from here, of course, if you're the Mets, you want to keep that momentum going as you head to California for the league championship series. And of course, clearly you want to try to get at least one game on the West Coast before you come back to Queens for the next three. Either way, it's not going to be an easy series for the Mets. And of course, for the Phillies, it's back to the drawing board because, we've seen this team be so close in recent years. 2022, they got to the World Series and fell to the Astros. Last year, once they got past the Braves, they were expected to get back to the World Series. They were up 2-0 on the Arizona Diamondbacks in the LCS before things fell apart, which included being eliminated at home, courtesy of Arizona. And of course, this time around against the Mets. The talent is there. Make no mistake about it. You have a lot of talent in this Phillies lineup. You have a lot of talent in this rotation. But the bottom line is the key guys did not come through for the Phillies. You look at the fact that their bullpen, which had several all-star players in that pen, they couldn't get it done in this series against the Mets. Like I said before, the bats weren't there. Aaron Nola wasn't like a typical Aaron Nola in game number 3 when the Phillies needed him. Zach Wheeler was in game 1. And I think even though the Mets won this series 3-1, getting back to Wheeler, having the cloud of having to possibly face him in game number 5 hung over the Mets. And, they did their thing as far as closing this series out. I liken it to the Mets in 1986 when they beat the Houston Astros in the NLCS, where it was one of those, hey, they did not want to face Mike Scott in game number 7 as he simply had dominated them throughout that series. And I think that was another scenario for the Mets in this one. Nonetheless, at the end of the day, the Mets were the better team. They deserved to win this series. And like I said before, anytime that you have a divisional affair, you simply throw out the rule book. The Mets are hot right now. There's no other way to say it. Francisco Lindor put this team on his back, and now it's simply every single guy, every single night is trying to be that guy to go out there and shine. And when you have a situation like that, like I said before, the Mets are going to continue to be a tough out. So we had the first postseason series between these longtime rivals. It goes to the Mets. I got a feeling we're going to see these teams face off in the postseason again at some point, especially now with the expanded playoff format. But nonetheless, the Mets are moving on, while the Phillies have a long winter ahead of them as they only can contemplate and ask themselves what happened and what could have been. But folks, that is going to wrap it up. And as always, I want to take this time out to thank all of you for tuning into the 300 Pounds of Sports Knowledge podcast here on YouTube. I want to take this time out to thank all of you fine folks out there for tuning in. And if you haven't already, please feel free to subscribe to this channel. Now, if you're on the X, formerly known as Twitter, please feel free to follow me at 300 Pounds of Sports. And like I always say, if you follow me, it'll be my pleasure to follow you right back. There's also the sports discussion group on Facebook at the Sports Depot 365 that you can check it out. Drop a line and be a part of one of the better sports debating sites going on social media. So once again, fine folks, my name is William Martin and I'm signing off. And I'm saying take care and have yourselves a wonderful day.